Ohio State on the road at Penn State. This is one of the most highly anticipated games of the regular season, going all the way back to the offseason. When you start looking ahead, this is a game that's been circled, obviously, by both teams and both fan bases, but by just college football fans in general, as a game which potentially could be huge with a lot on the line. And, of course, it's delivering. Both of these teams still alive for Big Ten championships, playoffs, all that kind of stuff. Ohio State with the one loss, Penn State undefeated. This one's going to come on at noon on Saturday over on Fox. I'm going to talk about the game in this video, and I'm going to attempt to try to pick a winner. I say attempt because, of course, Penn State quarterback Drew Aller was hurt in last week's game, did not play in the second half, and we'll talk more about that in this video. And let me apologize in advance, too, if you hear any noise or anything in the background. Most of you know the hurricane came through here about a month ago, and we had to get our roof replaced. Well, they're here today replacing the roof. So if you hear a bunch of stomping around or banging or whatever, I apologize, but they're literally replacing the roof right now. All right, Ohio State on the road at Penn State. And Ohio State is about a 3.5-point road favorite in this game in Happy Valley. The over-under 46.5. The Drew Aller thing really bothers me looking ahead to this game for a couple of different reasons. Number one, you never want to see anybody get hurt. That's first and foremost, right? Number two, it makes it really hard to try to talk about this game in a meaningful way in terms of what might happen on Saturday if you don't know whether or not Drew Aller's going to be playing, and we just don't know, and we're not going to get any kind of announcement, I would not expect. You're probably going to hear the same things from James Franklin every time he's asked about it this week, which is, we hope he can go. We hope he can go. We hope he can go. Probably not going to know for sure until maybe an hour before the game. He hurt his knee in the first half of last week's game. He did come back out on the field, but he had a knee brace on and he did not go back in the game. There are reports out there that say he was asked, do you think you can go? And he said, I don't think I'll be able to go, which kind of leads you to believe that maybe he was cleared medically. And so maybe it was maybe it was a pain tolerance thing. I don't know. And I don't know how much of that reporting is true. All we know for certain is that he was hurt in the first half. He went in the locker room. He came out of the locker room in the second half with a knee brace on and did not play any in the second half. That's all we know 100% for certain. So we'll try to break this game down, I guess, assuming Drew Aller is going to play. And then maybe at the end, we'll say, okay, if Drew Aller doesn't play, what effect will that have? That kind of thing. So let's start with Ohio State. They put together this roster in the offseason. Well, I say in the offseason. The majority of Ohio State's roster has been put together through high school recruiting. They're sort of getting lumped in with some of these other teams who have gone all in the transfer portal and things like that. And I don't really look at Ohio State in that way. Yes, they added some huge names through the portal, most notably Caleb Downs on defense and Quinshon Judkins, the running back, over on offense. But the overwhelming majority of Ohio State's roster and its starters are players that were recruited and signed out of high school by Ohio State and coached and developed and are now starting for Ohio State. It's also true that they added some superstars through the portal. And they've got a talented team. They've got one of the most talented teams in the country. Some people, Urban Meyer, chief among them, have suggested that maybe Ohio State has the most talented team in the history of college football. Well, if that's true, they're not playing like it. And that's not to say that they're playing bad. But when somebody like Urban Meyer, who has coached at the highest levels, has won national championships, has been around rosters, has seen rosters that win national championships, sort of knows what it takes in terms of roster makeup to get there. When a guy like that comes out and says something like that, it raises the expectations of what you're going to see when that team actually starts playing. And the reality is, when it comes to Ohio State, they've looked pretty good at times this year. They've looked really good at times this year. At no time this year have they looked like the best roster in the history of college football. Not a single time. They had the game on the road at Oregon. I thought that might be their best game of the year, honest. I know they lost that game, but if you watch some other Ohio State game, they looked better in a loss against Oregon than they did in a win against Nebraska. And I could point to some other examples before the Oregon game as well where they didn't play great. Now, there's a couple of, I think, specific issues you can point to with Ohio State in terms of sort of areas of concern. The first, I think, would be the offensive line, right? It was a little bit of a question mark coming into the season. Not a concern, not that you thought it would be bad necessarily or whatever, but you had some new pieces there. It was a little unproven, a little young, a little inexperienced, that kind of thing. And I thought they kind of played up and down a little the first couple of weeks of the season. And then everyone's sort of just waiting on that Oregon game. The Oregon game comes around. And in the first half of that Oregon game, that was a heavyweight fight between two NFL junior type of teams, two teams loaded with NFL talent on both sides of the ball. And then the left tackle gets hurt for Ohio State, and the second half of the Oregon game happens. And I know that Ohio State kept it close, and they ended up only losing by 1 and really had a chance to win that thing there at the end. They had the ball driving down the field. They couldn't run the ball in the second half against Oregon. And at the time, I kind of found it hard to believe that it was because they lost one offensive lineman, right? I thought maybe it was a coaching decision to just run the ball less, or just sort of the way the game was flowing or whatever. But as we've moved past the Oregon game now, this has continued to be a problem for Ohio State, the offensive line. Not just running the ball either. They've got some pass protection issues. Nebraska defensively was all over Will Howard on Saturday. Oregon was able to get to him multiple times, pressure him a few weeks ago in that game at Oregon. So they're still trying to figure things out at the left tackle position after the starter got injured. There are other issues along the offensive line, not injury issues, but just performance issues. The offensive line is just not playing great. Now, their wide receivers are unbelievable. Jeremiah Smith's off to an amazing start as a true freshman. Emeka Egbuka is one of the best wide receivers on the planet. Carnell Tate, I think, has played his best season of football this year. They've got weapons. Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson are two of the best 10 running backs in all of college football. Now, they've been limited the last 6 quarters, the second half against Oregon and again the other day against Nebraska. But again, I don't think there's anybody alive that thinks it's a running back issue at Ohio State. Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins are NFL running backs, period. The offensive line is the primary problem. And I do think at this point it's okay to call it a problem. It's moved past the concern phase, I think, when it comes to Ohio State offensively. When you look at Will Howard, he's obviously not C.J. Stroud or Justin Fields or any of this long list of QBs that Ohio State has had going back really about a decade that puts up, monster numbers, 4,500 plus yards a season with 40, 50 touchdowns and first round NFL draft pick type talent. He's obviously not that. But we've seen in college football over the last 3 or 4 years that you don't necessarily need that in order to win a national title. J.J. McCarthy last year, Stetson Bennett 2 years in a row before that. Mac Jones in 2020 at Alabama was a literal statue. I mean, he was a hell of a statue with a great arm, but he wasn't one, he wasn't Jaden Daniels, for example. He wasn't Joe Burrow in terms of their ability to move around, nor was J.J. McCarthy or whatever else. So I'm not even saying that about Will Howard in a derogatory way, right? I think Ohio State made a conscious decision a couple of years ago after they kept getting their ass beat by a physical Michigan team with a sort of game-managing quarterback, J.J. McCarthy. What was Michigan doing? They were running the ball, they were playing good defense, and they had a game-managing quarterback who could make a few third down throws and didn't turn the ball over. Same thing with Georgia when they lost to Georgia in the Peach Bowl, or the playoff game there. It was the same type of deal. And I think Ohio State looked around and said, this is great that we've got all these wide receivers and quarterbacks 5,000 yards, but what good is it doing us if we can't beat Michigan and we can't win a playoff game? They brought in Jim Knowles at defensive coordinator, and they kind of revamped from philosophically what they were doing as a program from the top down. And I think it's too early right now to say whether that was a massive success, a massive failure, or somewhere in between. Obviously, last year 1 with Jim Knowles and sort of first year kind of going a different direction. Did I say Will Howard? I hope I said Will Howard and not Honda McCord. If I said Honda McCord, I apologize. He obviously transferred out to Syracuse. I'm clearly talking about Will Howard at Ohio State as quarterback. Anyway, so that brings us to where we are now in terms of Ohio State heading into this game at Penn State. And I think this is the first time in a long time when this game has been played where there is way more pressure on Ohio State and Ryan Day than there is on Penn State and James Franklin. Ohio State already has the one loss on the road at Oregon. On the road here at Penn State. Penn State has looked really good at times this year. They don't have the offensive weapons and playmakers that Ohio State has. That's clear. But they're built a lot like those Michigan teams that Ohio State has had a hard time handling over the last few years. They play good along the lines of scrimmage. They have a great running game, really good defense. And their quarterback, Drew Aller, again, for the purposes of right now, assuming he plays, is playing at a higher level this year than we saw him play at last year. Now, he's not going to have any 50, 60, 70-yard touchdown runs, but I think he's a better quarterback than J.J. McCarthy, who Michigan had last year, right? This is a game that Ohio State can lose. Now, the problem is if you're Penn State, this is a game that Ohio State could have lost last year, the year before, 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 and they never do. This is the knock on Penn State and James Franklin, right? That's great. You go 10-2, finish ranked 9th every single year, but you can't beat the best two teams in your league year in, year out. A little bit of that is overblown when it comes to the Penn State hate. The reality is Penn State's been one of the top 15 teams and programs in the country during James Franklin's time there. They would have made a 12-team playoff almost every single year that James Franklin has been there. Now, none of that matters. We didn't have a 12-team playoff, so he was getting criticized based on the format we had at the time. And it is true. The guy's been there a decade. He's won the Big Ten once. He doesn't beat Ohio State or Michigan nearly enough. Now, the schedules have changed now. They're not even playing Michigan this year, but that's beside the point. So I think both of those things when discussing Penn State can be true at the same time. It is true. Penn State's been one of the best 10 or 15 teams and programs in the country consistently under James Franklin. They average 10 wins a year, multiple New Year's Six bowls. All of that's true. It's also true that they lose to Ohio State and Michigan way too frequently. One Big Ten title during the time that James Franklin has been there is not enough. They should have made the 4-team playoff once, possibly twice, while during the last 10 years. Both of those things are true. They're not as good as they want to be. They're also not as bad as they're sometimes made out to be. They're referred to as the most overrated team in college football. I don't understand that. For the last 10 years, they've been picked to finish third in the Big Ten every single year behind Ohio State and Michigan. And every single year, they finished third in the Big Ten behind Ohio State and Michigan. It seems like maybe they're the most accurately rated team in college football over the last 10 years. So all that being said, it brings you to this game here. Ohio State comes in with the one loss already. And when you look at these two teams' schedules going forward, it doesn't look like Penn State will lose any other game on their schedule at this point outside of possibly this Ohio State game. In other words, this is the hardest game left on Penn State's schedule. If they find a way to win this game at home, in my opinion, they're likely to win out. Ohio State, on the other hand, already has the loss to Oregon. Now they go on the road to play Penn State. And 3 weeks down the road, the week before they play Michigan, they have to play Indiana, which out of nowhere is looking like one of the best 10 teams in the country. If Ohio State loses this game to Penn State, not only are they in danger of not making the Big Ten title game again for what would be the 4th year in a row or whatever it is, they may not make the 12-team playoff. If they drop this game to Penn State, their second loss, and they're staring at a game against Indiana right before they play Michigan, Ryan Day could be in some trouble because there would be no excuse anyone could possibly make for this version of Ohio State to go 9-3 in the regular season and miss a 12-team playoff. There would be no a valid excuse for that happening. So I actually feel like for those reasons, there's more pressure on Ohio State in this game to win than there is Penn State. Penn State could, in theory, lose this game and still make the playoffs at 11-1, even if at 11-1 they don't get into the Big Ten title game. You know, if Ohio State were to win this game and run the table, That would mean that Ohio State would have beaten Penn State and then Indiana later on. So Penn State, Indiana, and Ohio State would each have one loss, but Ohio State will have beaten both Penn State and Indiana in that scenario, thus earning themselves a rematch with what will probably be an undefeated Oregon in the Big Ten title game. If Ohio State drops this game, then even if they beat Indiana, they may be left out of the Big Ten championship game, but at 10-2 would probably still get into the playoffs. So in other words, I just think this is a massive game for Ohio State. Now, it's nothing new for this to be a massive game because these two teams have been ranked inside the top 10, inside the top 15, the majority of times they've played over the last 10 years or so. So we're used to seeing this as a big game. But in terms of the pressure, it seems like it's usually on Penn State and James Franklin. Is this the year Penn State can finally beat one of the big two, Ohio State or Michigan? Is this the year James Franklin can get a win in one of these big games? Is this the year Penn State can finally knock off Ohio State? No, is usually the answer. It feels like the roles have been reversed now and that there is a ton of pressure on Ohio State to win this game on the road at Penn State. And let's be real, they are not playing well. They were lucky to get a win against Nebraska last week. I mean, lucky. They did not play well. They could not run the ball. Those wide receivers are amazing, and they saved the day per usual for Ohio State because Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, as good as they are, Nebraska dominated that line of scrimmage. Penn State's front seven is every bit as good as Nebraska's. Every bit as good as Nebraska's. So I do not think Ohio State's going to be able to run the ball against Penn State. So let's talk about how this game might go. Ohio State offensively against Penn State defensively. The game's at Penn State. The crowd will work in Penn State's favor, of course, when Penn State is playing defense and Will Howard and Ohio State are trying to run that offense. And Penn State's front seven, I think, is going to be a matchup problem for Ohio State. In fact, I think the matchup favors Penn State. Based off what we have seen up to this point from Ohio State offensively, particularly along that offensive line, it's hard for me to see a scenario where Ohio State just lines up and runs the ball for 4 or 5 yards a carry all day long down Penn State's throat. Remember last year's Michigan-Penn State game? That's what Michigan did. Remember, they didn't attempt a single pass like in the second half or something. They only attempted a couple of passes the entire game. But remember that game? Ohio State can't do that to Penn State. They don't have the ability. They don't have the talent along the offensive line to do that. They just don't. If you've watched Ohio State play any this year, you know what I'm talking about. If you watched them last week against Nebraska, you definitely know. They're not going to be able to line up and just run the ball at Penn State. That's going to result in a bunch of 3-and-outs is what's going to happen. They're going to have to open it up, Penn State is. They may have to pass first to set up the run as opposed to doing it the other way around. You know, a lot of teams like to establish the run, which opens up the pass later on for play action, things like that. Ohio State may have to reverse that this week. They may have to throw to soften that defense up just to be able to run the ball. We'll see. I do think they'll have an advantage at the skill positions, but can they give Will Howard time to sit in the pocket and make those throws? Remember, he's not the most mobile guy in the world. He can look, he's not a sitting duck. I'm not suggesting that Will Howard's got concrete blocks for feet and can't move or anything like that. But in relationship to the quarterbacks that Ohio State has had in the past, he's not that. He's not going to run around like C.J. Stroud. Never mind Justin Fields, okay? So I think that's the point I'm trying to make. If they can give him time to sit back there in the pocket and make his throws, I think Ohio State can win some of those battles on the outside against the Penn State secondary. I don't think they're going to have a lot of success running the ball, and if they're unable to protect Will Howard, I think it's going to be a long day for Ohio State. Now let's flip it around. Let's look at Penn State offensively against the Ohio State defense. Now, unlike the Ohio State offense, I actually think the Ohio State defense has played well enough this year. Now, obviously, you look at the Oregon game and maybe you find a few things you wish you could have done differently, forced one more punt in that game, maybe one more turnover, that kind of thing. That's the case in any one-point game. You can always point to something the defense or the offense did, or this player or that drop pass or this penalty or whatever the case. I think Ohio State defensively has played pretty well so far this season. Is that good enough to contain this Penn State offense? Probably. I actually like Ohio State defensively versus Penn State offensively. Drew Aller, let's assume for a second he's going to play. Well, number one, he's not the most mobile quarterback to begin with. Number two, if he does play, it's likely going to be with a knee brace and is going to limit his mobility even more. unlike Ohio State, I do think Penn State is and must run the ball in this game. Nick Singleton, one of the best running backs in the Big Ten, maybe in all of football. I've been watching him for a couple of years now. He's really good. They got a couple of backs back there, but Nick Singleton in particular is the one I really like. They, of course, have the tight end, Ham Hawk, that we all fell in love with a couple of years ago. That's kind of a matchup nightmare. I don't care who you are. Maybe him against Caleb Downs. Maybe we'll get to see some of that. But I don't know how Ohio State's going to choose to try to defend him. But Ohio State or Penn State's going to have to try to run the ball here, I think. Drew Aller sitting in the pocket on a bum wheel. You don't want him taking hits if you can help it. He's not a very great runner to start with. Now he's kind of hobbling around a little. But I think you're going to see a lot of Penn State running the ball, and they're going to have to be able to run it, I think, against this Ohio State. And to me, that's the matchup that's going to determine the outcome of this game. Can Penn State at home with the crowd behind them line up and get a first down on the ground on 3rd and 3 or 4 or 5 times in this game and keep a drive alive that results later in points, as opposed to settling and having to punt it away? I think that's what it's going to come down to if Drew Aller plays. If Drew Aller doesn't play, it's hard not to go with Ohio State. It's kind of hard to pick Penn State in this game anyway. I know that technically college football is like roulette in that it doesn't matter what the previous spin was. You know, it's our mind plays tricks on us. If you've ever played roulette in the casino, it can land on red 50 times in a row, okay? On that 51st spin, the odds are the same, red or black, as it was on the spin before. It doesn't become more likely to land on black because there's been 10 reds in a row. Each spin is independent of the previous spin in terms of odds on the roulette wheel. And we should look at college football the same way. It shouldn't matter when breaking this game down whether or not Ohio State has owned and dominated Penn State under James Franklin. But it's impossible to separate that from our mind, right? And the other thing is there are a lot of players on this Penn State team who have played Ohio State for, 1, 2, 3 years before in a row here and have lost to them every single time. And if this game gets into the second half and Penn State is trailing or it's close, the doubts start to creep up in the minds of the Penn State players. Here we go again. We just can't beat this team. And you can easily turn a win into a loss in that scenario. But if Drew Aller doesn't play, it makes it almost impossible for me not to pick Ohio State in this game. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to bet on this game, obviously. I'm obviously not going to make a bet or make a pick against the spread on this game right now at -3.5 without knowing anything at all about Drew Aller. Here's what I will tell you. If you were convinced before you saw Drew Aller get hurt, if you were convinced that Ohio State was going to blow out Penn State or at least beat them by more than 3.5, then there's no reason why you can't take Ohio State -3.5, because if Drew Aller doesn't play, then that's just another check mark in your favor in terms of winning that bet at 3.5. If you were considering betting Penn State in this game, I don't see how you can make the bet until you know what's going on with Drew Aller, and that might mean waiting right up until kickoff or just not betting the game if you're unable to find out any information about Drew Aller. That's the approach I'm going to take in terms of the betting angle on the game. In a game of this magnitude, with this much on the line, not knowing whether or not one of the team's starting quarterbacks is going to play or not, I'm not willing to risk money putting a bet on that situation. But here's what I'm going to do for the purpose of my pick. I'm going to assume Drew Aller is going to play, and I'm going to take Penn State to get the win at home. I'm just too concerned about Ohio State's offensive line versus what I've seen from Penn State defensively up to this point. I do think Penn State will be able to run the ball enough against this Ohio State defense to open up a couple of pass plays, maybe a couple of big plays, which is really what has held Penn State back the last few years, the lack of explosive plays. I'm going to assume Drew Aller plays. I'm going to assume Penn State's able to run the ball. And I'm going to assume that Ohio State is not able to run the ball. I like Penn State's front seven at least as much as Nebraska's front seven, and I probably like them a little more. And Nebraska's front seven just completely shut down shut down that running game of Ohio State. And offensively, I know that Penn State's not some kind of record-setting offensive machine. Believe me, I know that. But I trust what they have offensively right now more than I trust what Nebraska has right now offensively. They got a first-year starting quarterback there with Dylan Raiola. Not that he's not any good, he is, and he's played well at times this year, and he'll be even better next year. But Nebraska's just a much younger team than Penn State is. Penn State's a veteran team. They got some leaders on there. I trust what I have seen from Penn State this season a little bit more up to this point than what I've seen from Ohio State. And this is coming from I picked Ohio State to make the Big Ten title game. I picked Ohio State to win this game. I had Ohio State at 11-1 and winning the Big Ten in a rematch with Oregon. I picked in my preseason prediction, I had Ohio State going 11-1 with a loss on the road at Oregon, and then getting revenge and beating Oregon in the Big Ten title game. But they just have not been able to get it together offensively. And the offensive line is a problem that I don't know that can be fixed at this point of the season. You might just be you have what you have there at this point in the season. It's not a timing issue between the wide receivers and the quarterbacks that can be practiced out. Can they try different combinations of offensive linemen, switch some people around? Yeah, they could try that. But we're in week 10. I'm assuming they've been trying that all along, and it's not working. I think this is going to be a great game. Last week's game of the century, every week we're going to have a game of the century now, especially with the 12-team playoff. The 12-team playoff includes so many more teams into the category of huge games in November. So instead of 5 or 6 teams fighting for 4 playoff spots in November, we're going to have 20 or 25 teams fighting for 12 playoff spots now in November. So you're going to have these games of the century every single week now. Last week's game of the century didn't really live up to the hype. Texas A&M and LSU. It was close in the first half. Texas A&M blew them out in the second half. I do think this is going to be a close, tough, hard-fought game, one score, one possession game late in the fourth quarter. I'm going to go with the home team, assuming Drew Aller can play. I'm going to take Penn State to get the win. Appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.